Hi, I'm Gary Morrison, and I'm here interviewing Andy Gibbons for the History Maker project. Andy, can we start off by first having you provide us an overview of who you are, where you currently work, and your current position?
Certainly. I work at Brigham Young University. I've been there for 11 years. I'm a professor of instructional psychology and technology there. We have a graduate program. We don't have any undergraduate program. We'd like it. We have about 80 students. Prior to being at BYU, I was at Utah State University for 10 years on the faculty there. The thing that was unusual about being at BYU is that they invited me down and I thought I would be just a member of the faculty. But within a week after I got there, they were sitting on my chest, twisting my arm and asking me if I'd be a department chair. And so I finally said yes, and just this last August they released me, and so I'm as happy as a clown right now. I'm into the Elysian fields.
Could you describe your career path? How did you get to where you are today?
Oh, it was such an interesting story. I've had 3 careers actually. The first one was as a public school teacher. I taught 7th grade English in Springville, Utah. We had 6 classes a day, about 30 to 35 students per class. As an English teacher, we were giving writing assignments, teaching grammar, so it was a very popular class. After 2 years, we had a medical emergency that wasn't covered by the insurance, and so I decided to go back to graduate school. Actually, since I'd been working for the lowest paid district in the whole state of Utah, we were living below the poverty level, and so when I went back as a part-time graduate assistant, I actually got a raise, $500 a year raise, working part-time, which was kind of funny. I started, when I went back to graduate school, I was going to be a school principal and administrator, so I got enrolled in a leadership program. I had to take 3 kind of filler courses, 3 elective courses that first summer. And I took a course in learning theory, a course in Fortran programming, and a course in instructional design. And all of a sudden, all of the things that I couldn't do as a teacher, public school teacher, how I couldn't reach children. There were some children that passed on to the next grade, and I really don't think I'd made a dent in their learning. All of a sudden, I saw how technology-based education and stronger educational principles could improve my reach. So after that course, I changed my major. I enrolled in the instructional psychology. At that time, it was a program within the educational psychology department, BYU. And 3 years, I didn't stop for summers or vacations or anything. After 3 years later, I had a PhD. I didn't even bother to stop for a master's degree along the way. And it's that fire that was kindled by that first instructional design course has not gone out. I'm still as excited as I was then.
What are some of the ideas or approaches that have stimulated your professional growth?
There's been an evolution. I think we all go through evolutions. I think we all should. When I was a graduate student, of course it was in the days of behaviorism, and you know, I confess now, I never really believed that behaviorism was the whole picture. And we had a kind of subversive professor on the faculty, Dr. Harvey Black, one of my favorite people, who kept feeding us these subversive things written by unknown people like George Mandler and John Bransford. And at that time, he was a verbal learning, verbal behavior researcher, but he was talking in terms of cognitivism. And that made sense to me. And so I never really was a behaviorist, although I believe those principles are very strong in certain areas of education. Certainly they illuminate a certain part of human behavior and processing. But cognitivism has always made more sense to me, and so I guess I've always been by that persuasion. Ideas that when you talk about becoming an instructional designer, you can set theory aside. There's one way that you can set theory aside and become just a process-oriented instructional designer. And for a long time, that's what I became. Dave Merrill was my dissertation advisor. He was a wonderful mentor and had a great impact. His ideas, of course, had a great impact. So I became, for a long period of time, I became a very strong disciple. And when I went out to work in industry, which I did for 18 years, I was teaching people systematic instructional design, and I was teaching them component display theory and standard Gagne learning hierarchies, and very much like your own von Marenbor's 4CID. We were exercising those principles back then, and they were very powerful for the kinds of training that we were doing. What happened, though, was, and this is how people's beliefs evolve and their confirmed theories evolve, I found that as I was working in industry, there were certain kinds of problems that weren't attacked by that weren't approached by the things that I had been adhering to up to that point. And so and it was kind of funny how this worked. Dave Merrill, for instance, had a certain taxonomy of instructional objectives, and of course, those were the days of taxonomies. Well, I got out there and I found some things that weren't covered in his or Gagne's taxonomies or Bloom's that we were being asked to instruct. That is, the categories didn't match with what was being asked for in the real world. We were teaching pilots, helicopter pilots and jet fighter pilots and sensor operators in the back of a helicopter trying to find submarines, and all of a sudden some new kinds of categories were required. And I would go back and talk to Dave, and I'd say, Dave, what about this? And he'd say, oh, that doesn't need to be included in my taxonomy. But then it would appear in the taxonomy. And so there's always been this kind of a friendly dialogue where we were both kind of evolving in a certain way. I found that there were times where we had to teach processes, cause-effect processes. And the thing that really probably caused the greatest change for me was when it came time for me to start designing instructional simulations. The first thing that occurred as I was approaching projects of this kind was the systematic ISD process didn't lead me to make all of the kinds of decisions that I needed to make. And they didn't always lead me in the right order, telling me how to design a simulation as opposed to something else. And so I started inventing. I started trying to say, well, what do I have to do to solve this particular type of a design problem? Over a period of years, this is over a period probably of 13 years that I had to deal with these kinds of problems. I came to a set of intuitive categories about design process and how you make design decisions and how they cascade on each other and how they feed each other. And so I was always a devotee, and I always taught systematic instructional design. I always taught ISD. I was there before there was an ISD. I was practicing systematic design. We all were. But I kind of also discovered that I had Andy's way of designing, and that it was the way that a designer seemed to think. So after about 18 years in industry, I came back into an academic setting. Dave Merrill said, Andy, why don't you apply here at Utah State? We have an opening. And I said, well, okay, this is a good time, and I think I can do this. So I applied. I got the job. It turned out there's a kind of funny twist to this. I wasn't the first choice for the job. There was a guy from Canada that was really popular for the job, but he couldn't get his work visa to come down to Utah State. So I got the job as second choice. That's always kind of, that's me. But when I got back into the academic world, all of a sudden I was faced with the dilemma of trying to teach students and also advise dissertations and theses. and I was confronted with the question, what constitutes a worthwhile question, and the ways in which we answer those questions as technologists. We can't just use the scientific method, the empirical research method. There's got to be other ways, because I'd been doing those kinds of things in industry as we invented a lot of ideas and approaches of doing things. So I started reading and reading and reading. I spent $3,000 in books the first year that I was back in academic. And since then, by the way, and this, if we're talking to a group of young people who are aspiring to become designers and professors, you're going to have to read probably about that much to keep up with what's going on.
In the first year, and then it grows from there.
That's right. It gets worse and worse.
It gets worse and worse.
And my wife has finally given up. She's thrown up her hands and said, okay, go ahead, spend what you need to, and we'll eat on the rest. So I started this intensive study. Well, what I was studying was a lot of learning sciences literature, and I know that's a terrible thing to say. But at the same time, it made sense in connection with the things that I'd been doing for those 18 years in industry. And I started reading Bransford again, and saw that he had evolved, and I saw that other people had evolved with him, and that they were designing simulations, and they were trying to understand how simulations operate on the mind. And all of a sudden, some things came together for me, and so I started writing and writing and writing. And I published a book in about 1998, I think, on computer-assisted instruction. I think it sold 3 copies, 4, because I bought one. And what I discovered is that my thinking was moving in the direction of a different approach that didn't discard systematic instructional design, but it somehow filled that one box, the first D, the big D, the design box, and it helped me to understand what was going on inside that box in terms of a designer's thinking as they design. And so that has since then evolved into, and I've just continued to read, and I've probably done in the last 20 years more reading outside of the instructional design field. This is a terrible confession, and maybe this is where people will turn off the recording. I've done more reading outside of the instructional design field than I have inside, and I've discovered this wonderful world of designers outside of instructional design, and they know so much, and they have so much to give us. And so all of my writing since then has been helping to import some of these marvelous ideas, powerful ideas about instructional design, how designs work, how designers think as they're designing, into the field of instructional design. Now I find that what I've found out there and what I've tried to import has not destroyed what I knew before. It's all still correct and useful, but there's a larger way to understand it, and that's kind of where I've arrived at. So that was a long answer.
You've read all these books and still reading. What are 1 or 2 other individuals outside of Merrill, Gagne, Bransford that have influenced you? And what single idea did you take away from those 1 or 2 people?
Oh, there have been some great things. This would be hard. Let me just name a few names at random and then settle on a couple to talk about. Alan Lesgold and the Sherlock system. Robert Glaser and his evolution over a period of time from a behaviorist, confirmed behaviorist, to a cognitivist, and to the kind of the founder, I think, of the learning sciences field. I think some of the interesting areas of reading, though, haven't been in the area of instructional design. I think one of the books that this will be a strange recommendation. Of course, Herbert Sciences of the Artificial, very influential book on me. I read that as a graduate student. Dave Merrill asked us to read it, and it didn't make sense at the time, but it does now. Stuart Brand wrote a book. Now, Stuart Brand is one of the original hippies, okay? Along with Steve Jobs. Stuart Brand wrote a book by the title of How Buildings Learn. And the subtitle of the book is, What Happens After They're Built? Well, the answer to the question, what happens after they're built, is they begin to age immediately. And they're different parts of a building's design, and they don't age at the same rate. For instance, in this building that we're in, there's a steel framework inside. Now, they can change the outside of the building, they can change the allocation of inner spaces in the building, they can change the different services like electrical, heating, ventilation. They can change those services, but if they've designed the building well, those changes can take place without destroying all of the building. That is, the layers of a building can age at different rates. Well, in chapter 2 of this book by Stuart Brand, he talks about how a building ages and how the layers of a building can change. And I thought, wow, you know, I learned this in industry when I was working. I learned that if you create this monolithic software product that's got everything bundled together and hardwired together, you can't change the product. You have to throw away the old product and start new. If I could just figure out a way to modularize, functionally modularize the parts of an instructional product, I could make it so that I could unplug one part and plug in another part. And so a lot of my future learning was learning how to design instructional products that were that way, and I had some really interesting experiences and successes in doing that.
Okay.
One of the most interesting things is cascading style sheets. All of a sudden, it's apparent that you can unplug one surface and put on another surface if you design the product right. Okay, I'm sorry.
What was your, say, your first research interest, and then what has it evolved to today?
My research interest is design. That is, design-based research, when it came along, wasn't really a new idea, because we'd been doing it for 18 years. We'd been inventing things, taking raw conceptual ideas and perfecting them into products and marketing them. So design-based research just made a lot of sense. It's industrial R&D under a different name.
Okay. You've had a long career. We've had lots of changes that have happened in technology and design. What have you, I guess, the most significant changes you've seen over those years, and what do you think will never change in our field?
Well, what won't change is the basic, this is interesting. What won't change is the need to appeal to the human as a learner, and not to become so fascinated by our methodologies and our technologies that we forget what the learning process is like emotionally. You know, our brain evolves from infancy. It evolves on an emotional base. And even after we mature, after our brain's fully mature, and it never really is fully mature, there's always that emotional element that is really kind of the switcher, the conductor, it's the crossroads of all of our thinking and learning and memory. The emotional basis of learning never goes away. And I think one of the things that I would say is never going to change is that we're always going to have to respect that human learning process. It's never going to change that we first have to attract the emotions, the feelings, the conations, and then we can teach it. For instance, once you have a motivated learner, you can't turn them off from learning. You can't stop them from learning, even if you're a great designer.
Okay. What's been maybe the most significant change you've seen over your career?
That one that I just mentioned.
That's it, okay.
The insight that it's the human that we're teaching, and that if we finally come to respect the human nature and the human agency, we can teach it.
How would you like to be remembered in the field?
I would like to be remembered as someone who was willing to change. So much of our, well, for instance, I just came from a discussion of learning sciences versus the educational technology field, and some people feel that there's this distinction. And in the session right after it, there were some strong assertions of how people ought to, follow process and not be carried away by all these fanciful theories about constructivism. I think that we have to stand above that fray, and I'd like to be remembered as a person who tried to stay away from the categorizations, from the pride that comes with categorizations, and the unwillingness to change, the fixedness. I think if we expect our students to learn from us, we ought to exemplify for them a learning person. And every time we teach, we ought to learn, and the students need to understand that the professor learned also. I'd like to be
Good point.
remembered that way.
Okay. You've been to many AECTs. What's your most favorite story, memory?
The year they put me up for as a presidential candidate, I was unwilling. This was another situation where one person was sitting on my chest and the other person had my arm back behind me, and wonderful people. I've always felt welcome here. It's been a wonderful experience to be in this organization. I wish it was a bit more progressive in terms of its philosophies, but I love the people. That year, Barbara Lucky, of course, was the other candidate, and when I got up to give the speech, I couldn't think of anything except endorsing Barbara Lucky as a candidate. So I said, vote for Barb. And then I thanked everybody for what a wonderful experience it had been to be in the organization and sit down.
Well, thank you very much for your time. We've enjoyed
Thanks,
talking
Gary.
to you today.
Appreciate it.